What's up, y'all? It's Scott from Stringjoy Guitar Strings in Nashville, Tennessee, and today we're going to show you what a set of 17s sounds like on a regular electric guitar. Now, as I've mentioned before, we have players that play everything from 7s up to things like 19s or sometimes even heavier for very specific uses. Would I recommend the extremes of those to everybody? No, probably not. For a lot of players, they're typically playing somewhere between 9s and let's say 11.5s or 12s or something like that, but they do have their uses, and moreover, I want to show you today that it's possible to put really strange gauges on your guitar without necessarily causing any damage, or at least I don't think it's going to cause any damage. I haven't put a set of 17s on this guitar before. So the set that we're going to be putting on today in order goes 17 at the top, a 22 plain on the B string. On our third position, we're going to have a 30. That's going to be a wound string. We don't have a plain string that's quite heavy enough to balance decently in this set, so we're going to be going with a wound third. Then we're going to have a 40, a 52, and finally a 64 on the sixth. Now, each of these gauges will exhibit somewhere north of 40 pounds of tension on the neck, which is a lot of tension for an electric guitar. Typically, we'll see anywhere between 12 pounds and 16 pounds in the 9 to 10 gauge range for most electric guitars. So 40 is quite a bit, but it's not necessarily unheard of. Most bass guitars at 34-inch scales are going to have around 44, 45 pounds of tension on each individual string. So it's not necessarily an extreme, but it's a lot more than you typically see. As far as tuning goes, I'm going to play around a little bit and see what I can tune it up to before it starts to feel a little bit too tight. In general, a set of 17s is going to have the same amount of tension when it's tuned to G standard as a set of 10s will in E standard. There's a pretty common myth that people have that heavier strings are necessarily exhibiting more tension on the neck of your guitar than lighter strings, but the thing is, it all depends on your tuning. If you're tuning down to accommodate the heavy gauge strings, you're not necessarily going to have any more tension on your neck than you will with a light gauge set at standard. So without further ado, let's get this set of 17s on this guy. I'm not sure exactly how it's going to go. I'm going to mess around with it a little bit and get it all set up so it's kind of playing decently. I think right now I have a set of 12s or something similar on here, so it's going to be a little bit of an adjustment, but we'll see what happens. All right, so we have that 17 through 64 set popped on this 339 right now. It sounds pretty awesome. I messed around with a little bit of different tunings when I was playing with it. I think B standard, I've actually got it in open B because that's what I typically play in, is kind of the logical home for it, where I've got a bit of tension, but it's not too much. We could throw it in E standard, but it would just be extra, extra tight. But in B, even at this 24.75-inch scale, we've got a pretty wild, growling sort of baritone tone. I'm going to put on some drive because it's a little bit boring without drive when you're playing this low. I'm going to use the JDS 50 from my friend Jack DeVille at Mr. Black to give us a little bit of balls behind this whole tune. So some pretty crazy chuggy riffs, which is obviously the easy thing to do when you're tuned all the way down here in B, but you can do plenty else as well. So you'd think it would be really tough to bend with something like 17s on here, but it's not that bad, especially if you're tuned down as low as like B. Here on the high string, as you can see, I can do a normal whole step bend, but I can also even do like a step and a half without too much trouble. It's not as easy to bend as something like nines, but it's very doable, especially with this shorter scale on this Epiphone or Gibson style scale length. Tonally, the first things I notice is that we have a really heavy, meaty tone. The larger diameter of all these strings is giving us a little bit more output through our pickups, although they're just P90s, so they're not that hot to begin with, but we're definitely getting that thuddy, thunderous, sort of loud, powerful tone that a lot of players that play really heavy gauge strings are famous for. In terms of playability, do we give up a lot? In my opinion, no, not too much. Sure, it's a little bit harder to bend and it might take a little bit of getting used to. You definitely have a pretty mean third string with that 30 there, but none of it's stuff that you couldn't surmount, especially if you practice for a little while. You could probably get to where you're playing most styles this way, as long as you don't need like 2 whole step bends or anything like that. So, can you put 17s on your guitar? Yeah, absolutely. I would recommend keeping an eye on your truss rod, especially if you're tuning it up higher. That might need a little bit of adjustment. In general, going with heavier diameter strings is going to change your action as well. So if you want that just right, you'll definitely want to be able to dial that in once you go up to the gauge. But they definitely will work. And if you're keeping them into a more reasonable pitch, something like B that I have on here, it's not going to create any more stress or trouble for your guitar than you would see otherwise. This probably strings up somewhere around how 11s, 11.5s, or 12s would be in standard. So it's a little bit more tension, but it's not necessarily too much. Interestingly, I haven't really changed anything about my setup at all. That's mainly because I'm not going to keep 17s in this guitar for too much longer after I get done playing with them for a little bit. But the intonation isn't terrible. It's not great either, of course, but it's not awful. My action is a little bit higher than normal, but it's not too bad. So I think the lesson there too is you don't necessarily have to be super afraid about making, even extreme jumps in gauge if you really aren't too picky about a lot of your setup stuff. Sure, if you want it perfect, you're going to have to dial it in to be perfect, but if that's not your goal, it's not going to cause too much trouble for you. Should you try this at home? That's totally up to you. If you do, I would recommend not doing it on a super expensive guitar, or if you are, make sure that you have a tech nearby or somebody that really knows what's going on so they can keep an eye out to make sure you're not going to do any damage to the guitar. But again, if you have everything at the right tuning, you're not going to really be causing any much more stress on your neck than you would otherwise. And if you're like me, now you've got a baritone guitar and a 24.75-inch scale length, which I think will be a little bit of fun to mess around with, and definitely it's fun to be able to get that experience without having to spend hundreds of dollars on a new guitar. So I'm curious from you guys, what's the heaviest gauge of strings that you've put on your guitar? What'd you think of them? Leave them in the comments down below. Be sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel if you enjoyed it so you can keep up with more great stuff in the future.